The hammer came down 3 times, and Eliza Merritt became property. She stood on the auction block in front of the courthouse, her wrists bound with frayed rope, her dress torn at the hem where she'd caught it on a wagon wheel 2 days prior. The sun beat down on Crestfall, a town barely old enough to have a name, and the men below her squinted up through the glare like she was livestock they weren't sure was worth the feed. 18 years old, healthy, can read and write, the auctioneer called out, his voice scraping like boots on gravel. Debt owed is $47 to the late Samuel Granger's estate. Who'll take her? Eliza kept her eyes on the horizon, past the crowd, past the storefronts with their peeling paint, past the saloon where laughter drifted out like smoke. She wouldn't cry, not here, not in front of these people who looked at her like she was a broke-down mare. A man in the back raised his hand. He wore a black hat pulled low, and his coat was dusty from the trail. His face was hard, all sharp lines and no softness, the kind of face that didn't smile even when it should. He didn't look at her the way the others did, like she was something to use up. He looked at her like she was a problem he was deciding whether to solve. 47, he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. The auctioneer grinned. Sold to Mr. Callum Harding. Eliza's stomach dropped. She'd heard the name before. Everyone had. Callum Harding owned a cattle ranch 15 miles west of Crestfall, a place so remote that most folks forgot it existed. He kept to himself, didn't come into town except for supplies, and rumor had it he'd buried 2 wives already. She didn't know if that last part was true, but the way people whispered it made her skin crawl. He walked up to the platform, counted out the money in worn bills, and handed it to the auctioneer without a word. Then he turned to her. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair. He was older than she'd thought, maybe 40, maybe more. "Can you ride?" he asked. She nodded. "Good, horse is out front." He cut the rope from her wrists with a knife he pulled from his belt, the blade catching the light for just a second. Then he turned and walked away, not checking to see if she followed. Eliza rubbed her wrists where the rope had chafed them raw and glanced back at the crowd. A few women stood near the general store, their faces pinched with judgment. One of them had been her mother's friend once, before her mother died, before her father drank himself into the grave and left her with nothing but his debts. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, turned her back deliberately when their eyes met. That small cruelty strung more than the auction itself. She turned and followed Callum Harding. The ride out to the ranch was silent, except for the creak of saddle leather and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth. Eliza sat astride a roan mare that was gentler than she'd expected, and she watched Callum's back as they rode. He sat straight in the saddle, never once looking back to see if she was keeping up. The land around them was sparse, scattered mesquite, rocky outcroppings, patches of dry grass that whispered in the wind. Heat shimmered off the ground in waves. After about an hour, Callum spoke without turning around. "You run, you won't make it back to town before dark. Coyotes come out at night, sometimes worse than coyotes." "I'm not running," she said. "Good." They rode on. The ranch house was smaller than she'd expected, built from rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney that leaned slightly to the left. The barn was bigger, newer, and the smell of hay and horses hit her before they'd even dismounted. Chickens scattered across the yard, and a dog with one ear missing trotted up to sniff her boots. Its tail wagged cautiously. Callum swung down from his horse and looped the reins over a post. "Barn needs mucking, kitchen needs cleaning, fence posts on the east side need mending. You can start tomorrow." "What about tonight?" she asked. He glanced at her, and for the first time she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not kindness, exactly, more like hesitation. "Tonight you rest," he said. "Rooms upstairs, second door, don't go in the first one." He walked past her toward the barn, and she stood there in the yard with the dog circling her legs, wondering what she'd gotten herself into. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, painting everything orange and gold. In the distance, she could hear cattle lowing. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and sage. She walked to the house and pushed open the door. Inside, the main room was simple, a table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, a few shelves lined with canned goods and dishes. Everything was neat but worn, like it had been used hard and cared for carefully. The floorboards creaked under her feet as she crossed to the stairs. The room he'd mentioned was small, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out over the fields. The blanket was worn but clean, and there was a basin of water on the dresser. A lantern sat beside it, unlit. Eliza sat on the edge of the bed and let herself cry, just for a minute, just enough to let the weight of the day crack open and spill out. Then she wiped her face and went to the window. The land stretched out in every direction, rolling hills and scattered trees, the kind of emptiness that made you feel both free and trapped at the same time. She could see the barn from here, and the corral where a few horses stood, and beyond that, nothing but sky. It was beautiful in a lonely way. She heard footsteps on the stairs and turned. Callum appeared in the doorway, holding a plate with bread and cheese and a tin cup of water. "Didn't know if you'd eaten," he said. "I haven't." He set the plate on the dresser and turned to leave, but she stopped him. "Why'd you buy me?" He paused, his hand on the doorframe. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he looked at her, and his expression was unreadable. "Needed help," he said. "You could have hired someone." "Could have. So why didn't you?" His jaw tightened. "Eat, sleep, we start early." He left before she could ask anything else. His boots echoed down the hallway, then down the stairs, and then she heard the front door close. Through the window, she watched him walk back to the barn, his shoulders hunched against the evening wind. The work was brutal. By the end of the first week, Eliza's hands were blistered and her back ached in places she didn't know could ache. She mucked stalls, hauled water, mended fences, and scrubbed floors until her knees were raw. Callum worked alongside her most days, but he didn't talk much. He'd point to what needed doing, and she'd do it. On the third morning, she was carrying a bucket of water from the well when she stumbled on a loose stone. Water sloshed everywhere, soaking her dress and boots. She cursed under her breath and looked up to find Callum watching from the barn door. "Careful," he said, "ground's uneven there." "Could have told me that before." Something that might have been amusement crossed his face. Could have. She picked up the bucket and went back to the well. The days fell into a rhythm. She'd wake before dawn, dress in the same worn clothing she'd been wearing when she was sold, and make her way downstairs to find coffee already brewing on the stove. Callum was always up first. They'd eat in silence, biscuits, sometimes bacon if they had it, eggs from the chickens, and then they'd start work. He taught her things without really teaching. He'd mend a fence post, and she'd watch, and the next time one broke, he'd hand her the tools and walk away. She learned to shoe horses by holding the hoof while he hammered, learned to read the sky for rain by listening to him mutter about clouds, learned to tell when the cattle were agitated by the way he'd pause and listen before riding out to check on them. At night, she'd collapse into bed and listen to the wind howl through the gaps in the walls. Sometimes she'd hear footsteps in the hallway, slow and uneven, and she'd wonder if he was checking to make sure she was still there. She never asked. On the 8th day, she found the first door. It was early morning, and Callum had ridden out to check the northern fence line where a section had collapsed during the last storm. She'd finished her breakfast and was heading upstairs to fetch a shawl when she noticed the door was slightly ajar. He'd told her not to go in, but curiosity got the better of her. She pushed it open. The room was full of dust and sunlight. There was a rocking chair by the window and a cradle in the corner, and on the dresser, a small wooden horse with faded paint. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been breathed in years. Everything was frozen in time, a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the cradle, a pair of tiny boots by the door, a drawing tacked to the wall that showed stick figures of a man, a woman, and a child. Eliza stepped inside, her boots creaking on the floorboards. She picked up the wooden horse and turned it over in her hands. It was handmade, carved with care, and she could see where tiny fingers had worn the edges smooth. Her throat tightened. "I told you not to go in there." She spun around. Callum stood in the doorway, his face dark with anger. His hat was still on, dust covering his coat, and his hands were clenched at his sides. I'm sorry, I... Get out. She set the horse down carefully and hurried past him, her heart pounding. She heard the door slam behind her, and then nothing. She stood in the hallway, her breath coming fast, and listened to the silence. He didn't speak to her for 2 days. She kept working, kept her head down, and tried not to think about the cradle or the horse or the way his voice had cracked when he told her to leave. On the 3rd day, she was in the barn fixing a broken bridle when he walked in. He stood there for a moment, just inside the door, with the afternoon light streaming in behind him. Had a son, he said. She looked up. He died 3 years ago. Fever took him in 2 days. He leaned against the post, his hands shoved in his pockets. His mother couldn't take it. She left a month later, haven't seen her since. Eliza set the bridle down. The leather felt rough under her fingers, and she realized her hands were shaking. I'm sorry. Don't need your sorry. Then what do you need? He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the weight he carried. It was in his eyes, in the way his shoulders sagged, in the lines that mapped his face like scars. He looked like a man who'd been hollowed out and was still trying to figure out how to be whole again. Don't know, he said quietly. He turned and walked out, and she sat there in the barn with the smell of hay and horses around her, holding a broken bridle and feeling something shift in her chest. Things changed after that. He still didn't talk much, but when he did, his words were softer. He showed her how to shoe a horse properly, positioning her hands on the rasp and getting her through the motion. He showed her how to read the weather in the clouds, pointing out the high wispy ones that meant wind and the dark heavy ones that meant rain. He showed her how to tell when the cattle were restless, the way they'd bunch together, and lo, their heads all turned the same direction. She started cooking dinner, and he started sitting at the table instead of taking his plate to the barn. At first, they ate in silence, but gradually, words began to fill the space. Small words, simple words, nothing important, but they were something. Need salt, she said one evening. I'll ride into town next week. Thank you. He nodded. Another night after the dishes were washed, he pulled out a harmonica and played a tune she didn't recognize. It was slow and mournful, and it made her chest ache. She stood by the window, listening, watching the last light fade from the sky. Didn't know you played, she said when he finished. Used to, haven't in a while. It's beautiful. He stopped and looked at her, the harmonica still in his hands. You ever think about leaving? The question surprised her, every day. Why don't you? She thought about it, about the town she'd left behind, the people who'd watched her sold like cattle. She thought about Mrs. Patterson's turn back, about the banker who'd demanded payment for her father's debts, about the room she'd rented above the millinery that smelled like mice and mildew. She thought about the room upstairs here, the food on the table, the way Callum had taught her to fix a fence post without asking for anything in return. Don't have anywhere else to go, she said. He nodded like he understood, then he tucked the harmonica back in his pocket and stood. Good night, Eliza. It was the first time he'd used her name. Summer stretched long and hot across the land. The work didn't ease up. If anything, it got harder as the temperatures climbed and the grass turned brown and brittle. They spent long days hauling water to the cattle, checking on the herd, making sure the horses had enough to drink. Eliza's skin darkened from the sun, and calluses formed on her hands where the blisters had been. One afternoon in late July, a storm rolled in fast and mean. The sky turned green, and the wind picked up until it was howling through the yard, scattering chickens and rattling the barn doors. Callum ran out to bring the horses in from the corral, and Eliza followed, fighting against the wind. They got the last horse into the barn just as the rain started, fat drops that hit like stones and turned the yard into mud in seconds. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it made Eliza's ears ring. She stood just inside the barn door, soaked through, watching the rain come down in sheets. You all right? Callum asked. He was beside her, water dripping from the brim of his hat. Yeah. First time in a prairie storm. First time in any storm like this. He almost smiled, They come fast out here, leave fast too. They watched the rain together. The horses shifted in their stalls, nervous, and the dog pressed against Eliza's leg. After a while, the thunder moved off to the east, and the rain gentled to a steady patter. When I was a boy, Callum said, my father used to tell me storms were God's way of washing the world clean, said every storm was a second chance. You believe that? He was quiet for a moment, sometimes. In August, a rider came from town with news. There'd been a raid on one of the ranches to the south, Comanche, most likely, though no one was certain. 3 men killed, a dozen cattle stolen, and a barn burned to the ground. The rider warned everyone to be careful, to keep watch at night, to have weapons ready. After he left, Callum pulled his rifle down from above the door and checked it over. He loaded it, set it beside the door, and looked at Eliza. You know how to shoot? No. I'll teach you. They spent the next 3 evenings out behind the barn, Callum showing her how to hold the rifle, how to aim, how to breathe and squeeze the trigger. The kick bruised her shoulder, and her ears rang from the noise, but by the end of the 3rd day, she could hit a tin can from 20 paces. Good, Callum said. Hope you never have to use it. Me too. That night he slept downstairs in the chair by the fire, the rifle across his lap. Eliza lay awake upstairs, listening to the sounds of the house settling, the wind outside, the distant yip of coyotes. She felt safer knowing he was down there, and that scared her more than anything. September brought cooler nights and a restlessness to the cattle. Callum spent more time riding the fence line, checking for breaks, making sure nothing had gotten through. Eliza took over more of the work around the house, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden she'd started behind the barn. The tomatoes were coming in, and she made preserves, sealing them in jars and lining them up on the shelf. One evening, as she was finishing up the dishes, she heard a sound from upstairs, footsteps, slow and deliberate. She dried her hands and climbed the stairs to find Callum standing in front of the first door. It was open, and he was just standing there, looking in. Callum. He didn't turn. His birthday was last week, would have been 6. Eliza didn't know what to say, so she didn't say anything. She just stood there beside him, looking into the room with its dust and sunlight and memories. I keep thinking I should pack it up, he said, clear it out, but I can't. Every time I try, I just can't. You don't have to. Feels like I'm keeping him trapped here, like I won't let him go. Maybe you're not ready to. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were wet. Don't know if I'll ever be ready. She reached out and took his hand. He didn't pull away. Winter came hard and fast. The wind turned sharp, and the fields froze over, and the horses huddled in the barn for warmth. Eliza spent most of her days inside, mending clothes by the fire, while Callum worked on the roof, or chopped wood, or did whatever needed doing to keep them alive. The snow started in early November and didn't stop. One night the storm was so bad they couldn't see the barn from the porch. Callum came in shaking ice from his coat, his face red from the cold. His beard had frost in it, and his hands were so stiff he could barely work his gloves off. Storm's bad, he said. Might be stuck a few days. Eliza helped him out of his coat and made coffee while he sat by the fire, rubbing feeling back into his hands. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and finding every crack in the walls. She piled blankets on the chairs and hung a quilt over the doorway to keep the heat in. They sat by the fire, and the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt familiar, like an old coat. You ever think about your boy? She asked. He stared into the flames every day. What was his name? Thomas. She nodded and didn't press. After a while he spoke again. You remind me of her, his mother, not the leaving part, the strong part, the part that kept going even when everything was falling apart. I'm not strong, Eliza said. I got sold because I couldn't keep going. You're still here, aren't you? She didn't have an answer for that. The storm lasted 3 days. They rationed food, kept the fire going, and slept in shifts to make sure it didn't go out. On the second night, Eliza woke to find Callum standing at the window, looking out at the white expanse. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Never could in storms." She got up and stood beside him. The world outside was invisible, just howling wind and snow. "You worried about the cattle?" "Some, mostly I'm thinking about Thomas. He loved snow. First time he saw it, he tried to catch it in his mouth." Callum's voice broke. I can still see his face, the way he laughed. Eliza put her hand on his arm. "He knew you loved him." "I hope so." They stood there together until the cold drove them back to the fire. When the storm finally broke, they spent 2 days digging out. The snow was waist-deep in places, and several cattle hadn't made it. Callum was quiet as they hauled the carcasses away from the herd, and Eliza could see the weight settling on him again. That night she made stew from the last of the preserved vegetables and sat across from him at the table. He ate slowly, methodically, like it was a chore. "Callum," she said. He looked up. "I'm glad I'm here." His expression softened. "Me too." Christmas came quiet and unremarkable. They didn't have decorations or gifts, but Eliza made bread and Callum brought in a small pine branch and set it on the mantel. They sat by the fire that evening, and he played the harmonica while she hummed along. "Thank you," he said when the song ended. "For what?" "For making this place feel like a home again." Her chest tightened. "It's my home too now." He reached over and squeezed her hand, and they sat like that until the fire burned low. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, like it wasn't sure it wanted to stay. The snow melted in patches, revealing dead grass and mud. The creek swelled with runoff, and the cattle moved back out to the fields. Eliza started working on the garden again, turning over the soil and planning what to plant. Callum helped her dig the rows, and they worked side by side in the dirt, their hands black with soil. "Never thought I'd do this again," he said. "Do what?" "Go." She looked at him, and he looked back. And something passed between them that didn't need words. In April, new life came to the ranch. One of the mares gave birth to a foal, and Eliza spent hours in the barn watching the spindly-legged creature learn to walk. Callum stood beside her, his arms crossed, and she saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of it. "What are you going to name her?" she asked. "Haven't decided. What do you think?" "Grace." He considered it. "Grace, yeah, that's good." The town came calling in late April. A man rode up to the ranch, a lawyer from Crestfall named Morton Finch. He wore a suit that was too clean for the trail and carried a leather satchel. Eliza was in the garden when he arrived, and she watched him dismount and approach the house. Callum came out onto the porch, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Harding," Finch said, "I've come to inform you that Miss Merritt's contract is fulfilled. The debt has been paid in full. As of today, she is no longer bound to you by law." Eliza's hands stilled in the dirt. Callum stood on the porch, his arms crossed, and listened without saying a word. When Finch handed him a paper, he glanced at it briefly and then looked out toward the garden where Eliza was kneeling. "She's free to return to town or go wherever she pleases," Finch continued. "Of course, if she wishes to remain as hired help, that's between the two of you, but legally speaking, the matter is closed." "Fine," Callum said. Finch tipped his hat and rode away, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. Callum walked over to the garden and stood at the edge of the rows. Eliza looked up at him, dirt under her fingernails, the sun warm on her back. "You heard that?" he asked. "Yeah." "You can leave if you want. No one's keeping you here." She looked at the house, the barn, the garden she'd planted. She looked at him, at the man who'd bought her and fed her and taught her and never once asked for more than she could give. The man who'd shown her his scars and let her see his pain. "What if I don't want to leave?" she said. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, the wind ruffling his hair, his eyes searching hers. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden horse from Thomas's room. He held it out to her. Then stay, he said, not as hired help, not because you owe anything, but because you want to. She took the horse, her fingers closing around the smooth wood, and felt tears prick her eyes. I want to. He nodded, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled. It was small and uncertain, but it was real. That summer, they fixed the roof and painted the barn and let the chickens roam free. Eliza taught Callum how to laugh again, coaxing smiles out of him with stories from her childhood and terrible jokes she'd heard in town. He taught her how to live without fear, showing her that home wasn't a place you were trapped, but a place you chose. They worked the land together, and in the evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the sun set over the hills. Grace the foal grew stronger, and the garden flourished, and slowly the house began to fill with noise again, not the noise of grief, but the noise of life. One evening in August, as they sat watching the sky turn pink and gold, Callum reached over and took her hand. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For staying, for seeing something in this place worth staying for seeing something in me worth staying for." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you for giving me a reason to." He looked at her, really looked at her, and said, "You're not just help, Eliza, you're family." Her throat tightened. "So are you." The years rolled on, marked by seasons and storms and small moments of grace. Callum opened up Thomas's room and let the light back in. They turned it into a place for storing supplies at first, but eventually they painted the walls and put up new curtains. It hurt, but it was the kind of hurt that came with healing. Eliza taught herself to read better by lamplight, working through books Callum brought from town. He'd sit across from her and work on leathercraft or mend tack, and sometimes he'd ask her to read aloud. Her voice filled the house, and he'd listen with his eyes closed, a small smile on his face. They fought sometimes, sharp words over small things, money, cattle, whether to fix the fence or let it wait another week. But they always came back together, always found their way through it. One spring, 5 years after she'd arrived, Callum rode into town and came back with a preacher. Eliza stood on the porch in a dress she'd sewn herself, her hair braided with wildflowers, and married the man who'd bought her freedom and given her a home. The ceremony was simple, just the two of them and the preacher and the wind. When it was done, Callum kissed her gently, and she felt something inside her finally settle. "I love you," he said. "I love you too." Years later, when people in Crestfall asked about the quiet rancher and the girl he'd bought, they'd say different things. Some said he'd saved her. Others said she'd saved him. A few said it was a scandal, a man marrying his indentured worker, but those voices faded as the years passed and people saw the way they looked at each other. But Eliza knew the truth. They'd saved each other. On a warm September evening, she sat on the porch with Callum, watching their daughter, named Grace, after the foal who'd started them hopping again, chased chickens in the yard. The girl was 4, with dark hair like her father and stubborn determination like her mother. Callum's arm was around Eliza's shoulders, and she leaned into him, content. "You ever regret it?" he asked, staying. She thought about the girl on the auction block, scared and alone. She thought about the woman she'd become, strong and loved and home. "Not once," she said. He kissed the top of her head, and they watched the sun sink below the hills, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. The land stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving and beautiful, and they had built a life on it together. The past still hurt sometimes. Thomas's memory still lived in the quiet corners of the house, but it no longer swallowed them whole. They'd learned to carry it, to honor it, to let it be part of them without letting it define them. And in the end, that was enough. Grace ran up to the porch, breathless and laughing, and climbed into Callum's lap. He wrapped his arms around her and buried his face in her hair, and Eliza saw the man who'd been hollowed by grief become whole again. "Tell me a story, Papa," Grace said. "What kind of story?" "A true one." Callum glanced at Eliza, and she smiled. "Well," he began, his voice warm and steady, "once upon a time, there was a man who thought he'd lost everything. And then one day, someone taught him how to hope again. Grace looked up at him with wide eyes. Who taught him? Callum looked at Eliza, someone who needed to learn the same thing. And as the stars began to appear overhead, he told their daughter the story of how a broken rancher and a girl with nowhere to go had found each other and built something worth keeping. The wind whispered through the grass, the cattle settled for the night, and the house stood solid against the vast darkness of the prairie. Home,